It's good to see all of you tonight, and thank you for being here. As Jason said this morning, we got a list of sermons we'd like to do, and we try to get to them when we can. I've had this sermon on my whiteboard since like February, and it's because that this class, at least the large auditorium class, did the early part of Genesis, or the first part of Genesis early this year. And we had talked about some things in there that has just stayed in my mind and has progressed all the way to the Matthew class that we're doing currently in the large auditorium. And I'm going to kind of connect the dots between some things that were said in Matthew and some things that were said here in Genesis 11. Andrew, I don't know where you are, but I don't have the back screen. It's dead. Thank you. This is one I need to know where in the world I'm going. If you already know the story of Genesis 11, you know that we're sitting here very early in the Bible. Noah has gotten off the ark. The floods happen. And him and his three sons get commanded by God to do some certain things. And we have the flood covenant is given, or the rainbow covenant. And God signifies it with a rainbow, and God makes some rules. You know, the number one rule was you need to be fruitful and multiply and spread out. The other one was that animals are going to fear you now. They're going to flee from you. Another one was you're not allowed to eat blood at all. And there were some things given there, and that began this new civilization that was going to begin after the flood happened. I got it now. Thanks, man. And as that has happened, it seems like the next story is that this Tower of Babel is being built, and this is the moment where God confuses their language and forces them to separate. And before we studied Genesis together, I'd always thought this story was just something that, we talked about in kids' class. And it was just a good way to explain why there's so many different languages, even though we all come from the same ancestors of Noah's family. And it's a nice little way to explain it, and kind of read those 8 verses about it, and then you move on. Also, if you're already looking at Genesis 11, what is Genesis 11 surrounded by? It's surrounded by genealogies. Genesis 10 is mostly genealogies. The next half of Genesis 11 is mostly genealogies. And let's be frank, what do we usually do when we get to genealogies in the Bible? We skip it. And so we skip this story sometimes. But the more and more I've been thinking about this, I cannot get out of my head about how important this story is. And so what I'd like to try to convey to you tonight is how important this story is. And I want to recycle some things that some of y'all remember we talked about in the large auditorium class early this year. But I was especially wanting to recycle some of those things because we have some young people that would have an opportunity now to hear some of these things that we got to talk about, because we need to know what the history says and what Moses says and how those things fit so well together. So let's recap again. In Genesis 10, Noah's been given the covenant, and Genesis 10 gives us the genealogy of Noah. If you're looking just in 10 verse 1, it says, "Now this is the genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the sons were born to them after the flood." Then verse 2 begins, "These are the sons of Japheth." So, of course, we had Noah. Noah's the one who built the ark. He's the one who survived the flood with his family. And his 3 boys were Japheth, Ham, and Shem. Now, Japheth, if we look into his genealogy, you'll see there, verse 3, that there were men named like Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphaz, Torgmosh. The words get harder and harder as you go. And what's specifically said about Japheth that I want to hone in on is verse 5, which is he's the father of the Gentiles of the coastlands. And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. Noah's other son's name was Ham, and Ham had several famous sons. One of them was named Canaan, and we know that Canaan are the people who inherited the Canaan land originally, right? He had the Philistines. As well, he had Mizraim, whom Genesis tells us later is Egypt. And so you have these famous people, but the most famous of Ham's sons is who Genesis 10 spends some time talking about, and his name is Nimrod. And we're going to talk about Nimrod a little bit later on. Now, Shem is our other son. In the genealogy, he's listed last. And who is the most famous son of Shem? I mean, you could say Jesus if you wanted to, but here in the chapter, who's the most famous son of Shem? It's Abraham. And you have this little family unit being set up for us here in Genesis 10. This is why this is important, and this is why these lists of names are important, and I don't think we should skip them. If you look at ancient maps of where people lived and the names of those cities as far as back as we can go, you're going to find out something called the Acadian Empire. And in history, we talk about the Acadian Empire, we call it the first empire ever, that we don't know of any other empire that existed before the Acadian Empire. And this is a map of the Acadian Empire. And notice here, it has a lot of its principal cities named on it. Well, what I want to show you is how all of these principal cities are named here in Genesis chapter 10. And that's very interesting to me. To go back to verse 5, let's read about what happened to the sons of Japheth. From verse 5, talking about Japheth, it says, "From these the coastland peoples of the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations." And then he's done with Japheth. And he doesn't spend a lot of time with them. And I think we can make this very easy. What is said about Japheth is that his people went on to the coastlands, and he was the father of all Gentiles that walked to the coast. I have a very conservative view of this. I think all that happened here is Japheth's people went out. They did what they were supposed to do. And they kept on walking till they hit what? Till they hit coastland. Now, people, and maybe some good historians, they'll look at the people whose name Japheth of their sons, and they'll try to tell you which son went to what place. The Chinese claim that Japheth is their father. A lot of Germans claim that Gomer here, Japheth's son, is their father. There's a lot of people in North Africa that claim that Japheth's in their father. And guys, my opinion is that they're all right. You know, like they might as well all be right. That Japheth went out, they walked to the coastlands, they walked to Europe, they walked to Asia, they walked to Africa. And those are the people of Japheth, the Gentiles of the coastlands. But then you look at Ham. Ham here, as I already said in verse 6, mentions Mizraim, which is Egypt, Put, which we think is Ethiopia, and Canaan. And of course, you know where Canaan is. What did Ham do? Did Ham go off like Japheth's people did? No, Ham's people stayed. And they stayed in this area. And man, boy, was that right on my computer at home. I think this may have been my fault. I don't know if I hit keep source formatting. We'll see how it goes. Let's look at verse 8 here with me. Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one of the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. In the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Uruk, Akkad, Calneh, and the land of Shinar. And from the land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh. And I can stop right there. You see some famous names of the things that Nimrod built. Nimrod's the most famous son of Ham. And look at these places that he built. Well, as you know, Nineveh, and I know it's spelled differently here on this map. I'm going to say this 1,000 times tonight. In the ancient world, spelling doesn't matter. Why? Because the phonic alphabet didn't exist yet. So we're at the mercy of the translators to try to guess how it should be spelled in the phonic alphabet. You know, these people aren't hooked on phonics yet, right? So that's why Nineveh is spelled different. But Nimrod built Nineveh. The people of Ham lived here. Ham built Babylon, right? Babylon would have been in this area. Ham as well built Akkad. And this is the Acadian Empire, right? It says that Nimrod is the founder of Akkad. Now, again, in your New King James, if you're using it, it's spelled differently. A-C-C-A-D. A-K-K-A-D. Phonically, though, it's the same sound. Another famous city he built is Uruk. If you're reading the New King James, that's the word that starts with an E. E-R, right? But here it's spelled U-R-U-K. That's another place that Ham lived. So did Ham go out? No, Ham stayed in the land of Shinar, especially the cities that we see that Nimrod built. Now, let's talk about Shem. Look at verse 22. Shem, it says the sons of Shem were Elam, Asher, Arphaxadad, Lud, and Aram. And we can continue on with Arphaxadad's lineage, which leads us to Abraham. But where did Shem live? Shem lived in Elam, right? Named after one of his sons, which is we know as the Persian Empire. Shem as well lived in Ur. How do I know that the Shemites lived in Ur? Because Abraham lived in Ur. This is where Abraham lives. And as well, the Shemites lived in Asher, which we know is Assyria. And so those are going to be the names of the people who lived in Shem. The reason why I put this on the map is because I think it tells a story. And this is the story of Genesis 10 with the genealogy. Japheth did what he was supposed to do. He left. He went out and he spread out and he multiplied. He kept on walking until he hit water. And he's the father of all Gentiles of the coastlands. But Ham and Shem, what did they do when we match all these cities with their sons' names? Ham and Shem stayed in the Fertile Crescent. They stayed in the place that Nimrod calls here the land of Shinar. We don't call it that today. This is Iran and Iraq. But they stayed put. Can you guess what Shem and Ham did when they decided to stay put? That's Genesis chapter 11. That's the story of the Tower of Babel. And so just by using a little map like this and identifying these places with these people, I think we get to paint a nice story here that Moses is trying to make a point of. Let's talk about sources for the period. This is a strange time in history because we only have a few windows into seeing what's going on here right after the flood. The first one, obviously, is we have Moses' account, and that's what we have in our hands, right? Moses is living hundreds of years after this event, but he probably had a good idea of what happened. It must have been something that was discussed. As well, especially, let's not put away from the fact that he was inspired to be a prophet of God, and he's telling this story to God's people for the Lord. Moses gives the account of Nimrod, right? And he built these cities. Just to look at that passage one more time, look at chapter 10, looking at verse 9. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Uruk. And then later we see that his kingdom was Assyria, Nineveh, right? Do you think Nimrod was a good guy or a bad guy? If you're a Jew and you're reading this, do you think Nimrod is a good guy or a bad guy? What cities did he found? He founded Nineveh and Babylon, the two most wicked cities there ever was, at least biblically. You know, if you're a Jew and you're reading this, you think Nimrod's a bad guy. And if you read Josephus' account of this story, and again, that's external evidence, but in Josephus' account, book 1, chapter 4, he says that Nimrod was one of the most terrible people that ever lived. He was a tyrant, and he forced everyone to build the Tower of Babel. And that was their input of the external evidence of this story. Nimrod, I think, is a bad guy. And I like to, suppose that to you tonight. As well, if you look in other versions, not the New King James, but like the International Standard Version, it reads verse 9 as, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter in defiance of the Lord. So there's some other versions that agree with that interpretation, that they think that word there is defiance. It's very well that Nimrod is the anti-Abraham, that he was not a good person and he did not build good cities and he never had any good intentions. And I think that that is very possible. So we have that evidence there for Nimrod. Before we leave Nimrod really quickly, let me make this one point. Many of you know the name Nimrod not because of the Bible, but because of Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny often would call Elmer Fudd, the hunter, what? He would call him, you Nimrod. So in the American lexicon, that word Nimrod turned into mean dummy or fool, right? Because people associated it with Elmer Fudd. I've been spending too much, Abraham of Ur, Elmer of Fudd. Okay. But why was Bugs Bunny calling Elmer Fudd Nimrod? Because he was the mighty hunter, right? That was supposed to be the joke, but the joke got turned. So this is something to think about. Nimrod as well, not only did he build Nineveh and Babylon, but what did he build? He built Akkad. He built Uruk, which is right here. And again, I tried to show you the difference of the spellings, but they're the same cities. He built these famous cities, and certainly he has a hand in what we know today as the Acadian Empire. Now, of course, who else do we have as a main character? We have Abraham of Ur. And the only point I want to bring out of this is Moses says, where did Abraham grow up? Abraham grew up here in Ur in the Acadian Empire. He grew up in the land of Shinar. He grew up in the land of Nimrod. And that's important for the story when we get to chapter 12. What other sources do we have for the period? Well, we have Sargon the Great. And actually, thanks to our Nebuchadnezzar, who tried to preserve a lot of this history for us, we know about these people. And we know about a guy named Sargon the Great, who was the first emperor of the empire, Akkad. And he was of Akkad, and he was known for founding Akkad. All we know about Sargon the Great, well, we know more than this, but he reigned. His empire lasted for about 150 years, and then it all just kind of disappeared. But we do know that he was the first person ever to claim the role of emperor. And it wasn't just these little bitty villages everywhere in Iraq and Iran, but he actually had unified them after one banner. And so we know about Sargon the Great. The other person we know about this period is we know what we know from the Epic of Gilgamesh. And maybe when you were kids in elementary school, you studied the Epic of Gilgamesh. The story of Epic of Gilgamesh is not a story, we haven't known this story for a very long time. We've only known about the Epic of Gilgamesh since the 1870s. And it's because this story did not get passed down. It got buried, and we uncovered it and translated it. Somewhere in the 1800s, the Brits discover Nineveh, and they discover some clay tablets buried within the ancient city of Nineveh. And one of the tablets they took home to the British Museum in London is this tablet behind me, which we know is the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. There was a man named George Smith. George Smith is British, and in 1872, he begins to he had self-trained himself to learn how to translate things like this to get a job. And George Smith, if you want to look him up, his life's pretty incredible. He only died in his 30s, but he accomplished all these wonderful things. George Smith got hired to translate this Epic of Gilgamesh because no one had really tried to do it yet. It was very hard to do. George Smith translates what he has, and then one day he gets the opportunity to present his findings of what he's learned about this Epic of Gilgamesh. Nobody knows the story. And what he does is he gets a whole lot of people together. Even the Prime Minister of England apparently was in attendance. And he told them only one part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it was the only one part he wanted to tell. And the story kind of goes like this. Gilgamesh is looking for eternal life. And because his friend has died, he is looking for someone to make him immortal so he can solve the problem of death. So Gilgamesh on himself decides to go find the immortal man. And he goes and he travels and he finds the immortal man. And the immortal man begins to tell Gilgamesh a story of something that happened to him many years ago. And the story went like this. He said the gods were very angry, and so the gods decided to create a great flood on the earth. And the flood was so great it covered the tallest of the mountains, right? And he said, but it was all right because we constructed a giant vessel, we collected 2 of every animal, and we survived that flood. And lo and behold, the man tells Gilgamesh that when he started thinking that maybe the floodwaters were going down and that maybe they were getting close to be getting out on land again, he started getting birds and letting it out the window. And the birds would first come back, but eventually what happened? The birds stayed. And that's when he knew that it was safe to get out. George Smith translated that to all the people there in England. And half the room apparently was really happy, and the other half of the room was really angry. Because, what did it just do? You just were given a second account of the flood. And a story that very much so matches this Moses story that he gave to us in Genesis 8 and 9. So one half of the room says, you see, this is proof that the flood did happen. And the other half of the room says, you see, it's proof that the flood is just a legend that everyone always knew. Because it's not about the evidence, is it? It's about what you choose. George Smith translates this, and the whole world goes crazy. Gilgamesh gives us this little piece of, information in that world. What's even more interesting about Gilgamesh is he's from Uruk. And guess who founded the city Uruk? It was Nimrod, right? Again, here in the Acadian Empire. Now, before we leave Gilgamesh, let me make one point very clear. There is a big difference between the Gilgamesh story of the flood and Moses' story of the flood. Gilgamesh's flood, Noah, he outsmarted the gods. He was clever, and he was awarded with safety because of his cleverness. But in Moses' story of Noah, what was the situation? It wasn't that Noah outsmarted God, it was that Noah found grace in the eyes of God, right? And you could picture for a moment that this story is floating out there. And when God instructs Moses to write Genesis, what is God doing? He's saying, let me set the story straight. You've heard other stories about Noah. Let me tell you what really happened. We weren't enemies, we were friends. We loved each other, and I saved him from that. And so it's almost as if what this story is here is setting the record straight. Now, even more interesting, which story survived? You see, Moses' story got passed down. Moses' story has been around for 3,000 years. But what did ultimately the people living in this area do with the Epic of Gilgamesh? They buried it. Why? Well, maybe because the story wasn't right. But Moses' story, it survived 3,000 years. And I think that's interesting to take note. One more thing about this area for sources of the period, and kind of in terms of archaeology, this place is full of ziggurats. In Iraq and Iran, there are 25 ziggurats that at least we've uncovered. And what are the ziggurats? Well, they're temple mountains that are supposed to be reaching the heavens, right? And I don't know if they were building these things before they built the Tower of Babel, or after Babel happened, they tried to build smaller versions in every city. I don't know which one. All I know is that it's interesting that they're there. And it's interesting that this one here, which is the best kept one, is in Ur. And who saw this building every day when they were on their way to work? Abraham would have seen this same structure every day, probably, because it would have been built the time Abraham was around, we're pretty sure, and it's in the very city that he was from. So Abraham is living amongst this idolatry. He's living under these shadows of the story of the Tower of Babel. And maybe people are trying to repeat it. Maybe they're trying to continue it on. And this is the world that Abraham's from. And I think these ziggurats give powerful evidence to that. So those are our sources for the period, and everything, of course, takes place here in the Acadian Empire. If you've learned anything tonight, you've learned that there was an Acadian Empire, and it's spelled differently in the Bible. Okay. Now let me do this. Let's read Genesis chapter 11. Now, it said that Nimrod was in the land of Shinar, and now let's read what happened in the land of Shinar. Verse 1 of chapter 11 of Genesis. It says, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. That they baked brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad and over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore, its name is called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there, the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. And Babel is the word confusion in Hebrew, which is the same word Babylon. This is Babylon. And they built this tower, and they tried to stay one people, but the Lord stopped them, forced them to spread out by confusing their languages. I think this is what's so interesting about this little bit right here. We learned some things about their intentions for building this kingdom. And I put it on a chart because some of us are visual learners. What would they try to name this kingdom? Or what was the purpose of this kingdom? Well, the kingdom was to reach heaven, right? And we get that especially verse 4, that it's going to reach the top of the heavens. The founder probably was Nimrod. And we've already gotten that story that Nimrod went to the land of Shinar and he built Babylon. It's very fitting that Josephus is correct that Nimrod also tried to build the Tower of Babel. Who is the builder, though? Verse 5, God says that man are the ones who's tried to build this kingdom. What was their desire? What was their purpose in building this? Well, it was to make a name for themselves. And you get that right out of verse 4. They say, let us make a name for ourselves, right? Now, their language ended because the Lord changed their language, right? In verse 9. So the city would have continued to go on and continue to be built, but the Lord enacted a miracle, and he changed their language there and ended the construction of the tower. In terms of unity, what did they look like? Well, the Lord even says that they are to be one people. They are one people, right? And they all have one language. What were the materials they were going to use? I've just always thought it was funny in verse 2. They were like, yeah, they did have bricks and asphalt. And I can use that for something later, but it's interesting to think. He's like, yeah, we do have bricks and asphalt. What was the type of kingdom? Well, if it was built out of bricks and asphalt, well, then certainly it was a physical kingdom, right? What was its purpose? Well, was it not to glorify man? They were going to make a name for themselves, that everybody's going to come to them and see how they've reached the heavens. It was all about them and what their accomplishments were. Josephus goes to far as to say, and again, this is external evidence, this isn't biblical evidence, but Josephus says that the whole purpose of the Tower of Babel was Nimrod was trying to blaspheme God by saying, look, if you send another flood, it won't reach me up here. And that may be fitting to go along pretty well with the story. And what was their plans? Did it succeed? No, ultimately, all of their plans failed, didn't it? Because the Lord is like, nah. And that was the end of the story. Now, this happens in chapter 11, and then in verse 10, he begins to give us another genealogy. And that genealogy is to get us to Abraham. Abraham, of course, he lives in the land of Shinar. He lives in the Acadian Empire. And look in chapter 12, verse 1 with me really quickly. Chapter 12, verse 1, now the Lord had said to Abram, that's Abraham, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And so the next line is great, right? Verse 4, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him. Notice in verse 1, what does it say? Does it say the Lord said to Abram? What does it say? It says, now the Lord had said to Abram. This is something that him and Abraham have been talking about for a while, that Abram was going to flee. He was going to leave this country that we've been talking about, and God was going to set up something better for him. So let me do this with the next kingdom we know about, which is the kingdom that begins here in chapter 12 with Abraham. And what's that kingdom? What's the kingdom that begins here with Abraham? It's the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven, who was the founder? It was Abraham, right? 12:1, that you're going to get out of that country and I'm going to get you a new country, right? But who was the builder? The builder of the Tower of Babel was man. But the builder of the kingdom of heaven was going to be God. And that's what Hebrews 11:10 says, that Abraham waited for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God, right? But the other one was built by man. What was their desire? Well, the kingdom to reach heaven's desire was to make a name for themselves. And God points that out in verse 4 of chapter 11. Did you catch what was said in 12:2? What did God tell Abraham? He said, I will bless you and make your name great, right? It wasn't to make a name for themselves, but God desired to make Abraham a great name. Can you kind of see here when we read these stories right next to each other? God is succeeding in what these other people failed to do. He's going to make a great name for Abraham. Now, in terms of language, the city of Babel ended because the Lord changed their language. What am I going to put in the other one now? But the kingdom of heaven began because the Lord worked a language miracle. In Acts chapter 2, when he gave the apostles the ability to communicate in any language they needed to spread the gospel. Have y'all ever thought that was an interesting way to prove himself there in Acts 2? I mean, I've never seen the miracles firsthand, right? I don't know which ones were the greatest. But I could just picture there would probably be some better miracles out there. You know, maybe a healing, maybe a miraculous of anything else, right? But instead, the miracle that God decides to go with there in Acts 2 was, I'm going to make sure everyone can hear in their native tongue. Why is that? Is it not a callback to the Tower of Babel? If it's not, I don't know what it is. That it's almost like God separated them there in Genesis 11 and Acts 2 with his kingdom. What does he do? He brings them all together, right? And he does that with the power of the apostles there. The unity was to be one people in the Tower of Babel, but in the kingdom of heaven, they became one people in Christ, right? Colossians 3:11. There is no Greek nor Jew, but we are all Christ, all in all. The materials were bricks and asphalt, but what materials is the kingdom of heaven made out of? Peter says it's made out of living stones. And that means that it's made out of people, right? And those people work together to construct themselves into the house of God. That works well with the next one. The type was a physical kingdom, but the kingdom of heaven is a spiritual kingdom. John 18:36, Peter, let me get to him, Jesus. Jesus says that his kingdom is not of this world. And if it was of this world, the people would be fighting. But he's like, I'm not of this world. This is a spiritual kingdom. The purpose of the Tower of Babel was to glorify man. But the purpose of the kingdom of heaven is to glorify God, right? You can get that from Ephesians 3:21. May the church glorify him forever, for all generations, forever and ever, amen. There's a totally different purpose here. Now, because this different purpose is happening, did the plan fail or did it succeed? The Tower of Babel failed. You know, what's fun to think about is the rubble of Babel is probably sitting there still somewhere in Iran. But we just don't know that that one's actually supposed to be the tower because they never finished. You know, it's rubble. But did the kingdom of heaven, did it fail? No, we're succeeding. And we're still succeeding, right? We're still here. And we're still adding living stones to that structure. We've actually never stopped the building process. The kingdom of heaven has succeeded. And it started right here in chapter 12 of Genesis when God came to Abram and said, Abram, get out. Come to this Canaan land, and we're going to start anew, and I'm going to make a name out of you. I'm going to make you a great nation. And so this has succeeded. And I like this little chart. It just helps me keep the parallel going, which why I think, again, this story is so significant. What happens in the Tower of Babel, it's almost like the anti-kingdom of heaven, just like Nimrod is the anti-Abraham. To wrap this up, make one point with me, and it's a big point. Don't think we're going to be done too fast, but it's a big point. We have forgotten about somebody, and that is the other brother, Japheth. It seems like the way that I read it is that Ham and Shem took place in what was going on in the land of Shinar, but Japheth left. Well, Japheth comes back into the story now. In chapter 9, when Ham sinned, Noah curses Ham and he blesses Shem and Japheth. And this blessing or this prophecy has always confused me. This is what Noah says to Shem and Japheth in chapter 9:26. It says, and he said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. How was Shem going to receive Canaan, the son of Ham, as a servant? If you've read the book of Joshua, you know how, right? Joshua is a Shemite. He's a son of Abraham. And when Joshua and the other children of Israel invade the Canaan land, what do? I mean, they wipe up, right? They take all their stuff, and the people they don't kill, they end up keeping as prisoners, which they weren't supposed to. But Canaan ends up serving and be forced into servitude under the people of Abraham, Joshua's people, right? So did this prophecy come true? Yes, Noah was right? That Shem would prosper and Canaan would become his servants. The most famous son of Shem, Abraham, would end up adopting the Canaan land, taking it for his own. Now, what about the second one? May God enlarge Japheth. If Japheth is the father of all of us in Asia and Africa and Europe, are we the largest tribe? Let's just name the big three continents. And, they're all claiming here that they're the sons of Japheth. Did his tents enlarge? Yeah, they did, right? The Japheth is the majority of people walking on this earth. If you're here right now, you might as well just claim you're a child of Japheth. Anyone, anywhere might as well just claim they're a child of Japheth. That they spread out, God enlarged them. They became the majority of people who possess the earth. And may he dwell in the tents of Shem. Well, hold on just a second. What does that mean? Japheth is going to go out, but then they're going to come back and they're going to dwell in the tents of Shem? Do we dwell in the tents of Shem? Do y'all remember what Jesus said to the centurion? In Matthew 8, the centurion runs to Jesus, who's a Gentile, right? He's a child of Japheth. And he comes to Jesus and says, I have a servant that's sick. And Jesus says, okay, well, I'll head over to your house. And the centurion goes, no. You don't need to say that. No, you do need to say it, right? You don't need to come. Just say the word, Jesus, and it'll be so. I do the same thing. I have servants. I tell them to go and come, and they do it. Well, Jesus, you just say he's going to be healed, and I'll believe, and I'll go home, and I'll see that he's healed. And this is Jesus' response to the son of Japheth. He says, when Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to those who followed, surely I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. That the Gentiles are going to come, and they're going to come and sit in the tents of Abraham, and Isaac, and Jacob. That they're going to come and they're going to have fellowship with the children of Shem. So is Noah right? Were we going to go back and dwell in the tents of Shem? For Christians, yes, right? It was going to be the Gentiles, when they obeyed the gospel, they were going to come back and dwell with Abraham and be of Shem's people. Now, here's the next tricky part. And may Canaan be his servant. Well, hold on just a second. I have never invaded the Canaan land. Right? I have never gone over there and took, the Canaanite stuff. I wasn't alive then, and neither were you. Well, it's very obvious to see how the Canaanites were the servants of Joshua. I mean, he was literally there. But were the Canaanites also the servants of people who lived in Jesus' day? Peter, Andrew, James, and John, the Jews? Can I suggest to you that the Canaanites served them in this way? That when they were little kids, they would go to synagogue and they'd have a teacher tell them stories about how they possessed the Canaan land and how Joshua stopped the sun and the moon. And they told these wonderful, great stories about how God gave the Canaan land, Canaan's land, to you. Did Canaan serve those kids hearing those stories growing up? Yeah, he did. Canaan was the bad guy in their stories. He served them as being the villain in their stories. And now Noah's prophecy has come true. Canaan's the villain from here on out. People, we don't even know who Canaan is, and neither did they. Now, for a whole bunch of people living in Alabama, does Canaan serve us in that same way? Is Canaan not the villain in your stories? I'll give you one better. If you grew up in a church, in the little kids class, did y'all sing Dare to Stand Like Joshua? I remember singing that song as a little kid in Bible class. I enjoyed that one. Y'all know what the first line of Dare to Stand Like Joshua is? We are bound for Canaan's land. It's not the Canaan land, it's Canaan's proper noun land. You got a whole bunch of little Japheth kids over here singing about how they're bound for Canaan's land. Did Japheth going to have Canaan as a servant? Yeah, all his kids are singing about it. And it just amazes to me how you can go to Africa, and you can go to Asia, and you can go to Europe, and you can go to all the Americas, and you can find little kids everywhere. All of Japheth's little kids everywhere singing about how they're bound for the Canaan land, how they dwell in the tents of Shem, how Abraham is their father. Where did that all start? That started all right here with the Tower of Babel. And I think that's why this story is so significant. One thing that made me think of this is I was watching the Hulu documentary about the Taiwanese kids that they saved out of that cave. And it was great. I loved it, right? And they're pulling one of these Taiwanese kids out of the cave, and they say, who's this? In the documentary, they say, this is Mark. You know, why is this little Taiwanese boy named Mark? Why do I know people here named Mark? It's because this is our people. And all of Japheth's descendants get to claim that these are our people, and we're welcome to come and be part of this kingdom. And Mark is one of our more important ones that we all know. We're all invited to come and be part of the tents of Shem. We're all invited to come from east and west and sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And who all made that possible? Jesus Christ made all that possible. That he opened the door for all of Japheth's sons to come and sit with Abraham. If there's anyone here tonight that either needs to first take that first step into the tent of Shem by obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ and receiving forgiveness of sins, or if there's anyone here that has forgotten about their story and they've forgotten about their people and they like our assistance, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing?